Hey guys, I got something really special in my bag. It is the top 5 tennis rackets of all time. And guys, don't worry, I'm not gonna start pulling out old rackets like the Dunlop 200G or the Borg wooden racket or the Prince graphite. Yes, these are really great rackets, but they don't qualify my strict requirements when it comes to the top 5 rackets of all time. The top 5 rackets of all time that I selected have withstood the test of time and are still in production today, and I use both at the professional level and at the recreational level. So let's get right into it. Let me put these back and select the first top 5 racket. This racket is not in the top 5. This is the Wilson Hyperhammer 5.2. This is a racket that was predominantly used by WTA players, and it was used by Todd Martin, I'm not sure why, for a brief amount of time, but it was used by me for 15 years. And no, this racket is not in the top 5. I don't even think it cracks the top 100, but since I'm gonna play test the top 5 rackets of all time, I need to use this racket to calibrate my arm, because when I use different rackets, sometimes I get a little bit of pain. So I'm gonna have to hit with the old Hyper Hammer to get my arm prepared for today's video. Now this racket has healing properties. This is a magical racket. I used it for 15 years and it is probably my favorite racket of all time. It is not in production anymore. It's impossible to come by, and it's got a really small head, 95 square inches. And if you're interested in finding out more interesting stories about myself and this racket and the healing properties it has, you can check out my video titled My Racket History. All right guys, the arm feels good. We're gonna get started with number 5 on the list of the greatest rackets of all time, and it is the Yonex VCore. Guys, this is one of the most up and coming rackets. I see a lot of juniors starting to play with Yonex. There's a lot of professional players who are switching to Yonex. This is an absolute fantastic brand, and all the rackets in their lineup, it doesn't necessarily have to be the VCore. It could be the VCore Pro or the E-Zone. These are phenomenal rackets. The quality control of this company is absolutely astonishing, and is one of the only brands that's still made in the country where it comes from. It's still made in Japan. Now this is the 6th generation of this racket, so it's been around for a little while, and obviously there's some great players that play with it. Angelique Kerber, Denis Shapovalov, and overall Yonex has a lot of players like Kyrgios and Osaka who played with Yonex rackets. But my prediction is that more and more professional players will switch to Yonex because it is a phenomenal racket, and players have already started switching, which is something that you don't see so frequently. Players such as Steve Johnson, Jeannie Bouchard, and Monica Puig have switched from Babolat to Yonex. So let me play a few balls with this racket and I'll let you guys know how it feels. So right away I can tell the control is phenomenal. It is a softer frame, that's what it feels like to me. It doesn't have too much stiffness, but it has a good power level as well. I feel like the ball is coming off the racket quite fast, but the control is incredible, guys. This racket is absolutely phenomenal. I can see how a wide variety of players can adapt to this racket, from the rec level to the pro level. Let me hit a serve and see what the VCore feels like. Oh yeah, no, definitely the power level on the racket is good, so I can get plenty of pop. It's not a dead racket by any means, but it's also not too lively. It's still got enough control where I have this feeling that I can swing completely out on my strokes and I don't have to be careful. So in addition to all this stuff, I find it really important what a racket looks like, the aesthetics of a racket, and this is just a beautifully designed racket. See, I don't really mind the head shape. This is a 95 VCore, just kind of a square head. It's okay with me. I know some players have a hard time adapting to that, but I think you get used to it quite fast, and you actually might have some advantages on the two-handed backhand at least. That's what Nick Kyrgios says. So nevertheless, this is an absolutely beautiful racket. It's beautifully designed. It is like a Japanese sword, and I'm making the prediction that Yonex is going to keep growing, and these type of rackets are going to be used more and more, both on the professional tour and the recreational level. Okay guys, here comes number 4 on my list of top 5 rackets of all time, and it is the Head Prestige. This is a legendary frame, guys. Look how beautiful this racket is. Now the Head Prestige is still around today, and it was launched in 1987 and has been relaunched 17 times in the last 34 years. And some great players have played with this racket: Guga Kurtin, Goran Ivanišević, and Marat Safin. I gotta tell you, this is a racket that's really popular in South America and in Europe. Not quite as much in the USA, yet it is popular here as well. But when you go to Europe, for example, you see a lot of guys using the Head Prestige. And my college coach, Mel Purcell, always wanted me to play with this racket. Maybe he thought because Ivanišević played with it and he had a good serve, and he thought I had a pretty good serve, that this racket would suit me well. But I could never adapt to this racket. It was a little bit too thin for me to beam, and it was a little bit too flexible, the racket. I was used to playing with stiffer rackets who had more of a wide beam. But guys, this is an absolute masterpiece. This racket is absolutely beautiful. It does have some interesting things going for it. The way the grommets are designed, you take a look at the grommets, it's not like an open grommet, it's kind of closed in, so you can't really see the string. This is something that's unique about the Head Prestige, I believe. And overall, it's a very thin racket, and what I remember from playing with Head Prestiges, testing them out in the past, it is a low power racket. So this is the type of racket that you do have to hit the ball quite hard to get power. On the other hand, this is a racket that gives you a tremendous amount of feel. And guys, this is a player's racket. I don't think it's quite suited for the beginner level, or a lot of females are uncomfortable playing with rackets like this. And I can tell you that as I'm hitting, I can feel the frame vibrating. It is a very soft frame, and it's quite low powered. This is why I personally never really liked the Prestige, but some people do. You know, I know a lot of players who are lifelong Prestige players. So let me rip a couple and let's see what happens. And let's see what the Prestige is all about on the serve. The greatest server of all time, in my opinion, is Goran Ivanišević, and he played with the Prestige. Serve does feel phenomenal with the Head Prestige, so if you have good serve mechanics, this racket will reward you greatly. And the reason why I put the Head Prestige at number 4, because it's such a classic racket. It's been around forever, and there are still players on tour today playing with this racket. For example, Marin Cilic. As I said before, not necessarily used that much at the recreational level, but nevertheless, the Head Prestige, such a classic racket, deserves the number 4 spot. Okay guys, now it's gonna get exciting, because the number 3 racket is one of the greatest rackets ever designed, and it is the Babolat Pure Aero. And guys, this racket came out in 2003 with the sole purpose of allowing tennis players to play with more topspin, because they designed the racket in a genius way. They made it aerodynamic. Take a look at the throat. You see how thin it is here, and then it widens out towards the top. So you probably think to yourself, why didn't they make the frame thin in the front? Because Babolat knows exactly what the swing path on a topspin stroke looks like. And what it is, it's a vertical swing path where the racket is going upwards shortly after the contact. And it makes sense that when the racket is vertically going up and over the ball, that the thin part of the frame is on the side. And this is why this racket is so genius when it comes to topspin. Not only that, but the frame in itself is thin all the way around. You can see how thin the edges are here, and you can see how thin the edges are here. So this is an aerodynamic monster, and if you do happen to have topspin strokes, this racket will absolutely help you to be able to generate more topspin. Now remember, I said you have to know how to make topspin. So if you're more of a flat ball striker like myself, this racket might not be suited for you, and that's exactly what happened to me. My favorite player of all time was Rafa. I wanted to play with this racket so bad. I tried to play with it for 2 years. I tried all the different versions. I tried the Plus, I tried the Tour version, I tried the regular version, and I just simply couldn't play with it because it took away a little bit of pace on my serve. I could definitely feel a difference on my topspin forehand. I could feel a difference on my slice. I could even feel a difference on my kick serve, but I felt like overall there was a small reduction of pace on my flat serve, and this is why I couldn't choose this racket, but it remains to be one of my favorite rackets of all time. And guys, this racket is so versatile. It's used by tons of WTA players. It's used by tons of ATP players. It's also used widely at the recreational level. So this is a great thing about the Babolat Aero, is that not only is it good for pro level players, it's also good for the recreational level. All right guys, let me hit a few balls with the Aero. Now there was a stat that I read a while back that out of the top 500 players on both the WTA and the ATP Tour, the most commonly used racket was the Babolat pure Aero. I don't know if this stat is still accurate. I told you the Yonex is coming up strong, but at one point in time, this was the case. This was the most widely used racket on the professional tour inside the top 500. So as I'm hitting these forehands, the big advantage of this racket is that when you're going up on the ball, there's less resistance on the frame, and it is not a marketing gimmick. It is really true. You do feel less resistance. The racket whips through the air a little bit faster, and I do feel that when I'm hitting my topspin forehands. The same is going to be true on a kick serve, where we have a more lateral swing path. As you're going laterally across the ball, there's less resistance on the frame, and you are going to get a little bit more kick on your serve. But having said all that, when I do my flat bomb, I don't feel quite as much power as I do with other rackets. That's why ultimately I couldn't play with this racket, but this doesn't mean that's going to be the case for you. There's a lot of players who can hit a tremendous amount of power on their flat serves even with this racket. So this is an absolute legendary racket that's been around for a while, since 2003, and it's going to stick around forever, and this is why I placed it at number 3 on my top 5 rackets of all time. Are you guys ready for number 2? This is the best selling racket of all time. There's more people around the globe playing with this racket than with any other racket in history, and that is the Babolat Pure Drive, which happens to be the racket that I play with. Guys, on the serve, nothing is better than the Pure Drive. You guys remember this guy called Andy Roddick, the guy who can serve like 150 or something like that? He used a Pure Drive. So this racket, when it comes to power, especially on the serve, is unparalleled in the racket industry. Now, all the attributes that the Pure Aero has going for it, the Pure Drive has them as well. This is one of the rackets that bridges the gap between the professional level and the recreational level the most. You will see recreational players playing with this racket, you will see juniors playing with this racket, and of course you will see some incredible professional players playing with this racket as well. And this racket has been around longer than you think. It came out in 1994 and it was used by some really great players. I already mentioned Andy Roddick, but also Carlos Moya and countless WTA players. This is a very popular racket on the WTA tour. And I think the magic of this racket lies in the fact that it's such a powerful racket that it's suited for some people who are not naturally very strong. I think this is also the reason why I personally like it. I'm not a naturally very athletic person, so I like a racket to give me a little bit more feedback, to help me out a little bit more, in other words. And I think this is why it bridges the gap so well between the pro level and the recreational level. And it could also possibly be the reason why so many WTA players play with this racket. Now, the reason why it's so powerful, it is a stiff racket, so there is some concern when it comes to the tennis elbow, but surprisingly, a lot of the juniors that play with this racket never really suffer from tennis elbow, and the recreational players that I encounter who play with this racket also seem to be fine. However, I will say that some people do complain about tennis elbow that play with this racket, especially if it's strung wrong. I want to alert you that this racket is a little bit on the stiff side, but because it's so stiff, it is very responsive. The ball just shoots off the racket like you can't imagine. And guys, take a look at this frame. It's a little bit wider. I already told you that I like playing with a wider frame, and I find that wider frames give more power. And also, similar to the Aero, it's a very thin design on the outside. So this racket whips through the air quite well. So even though it's not quite as good for spin as the Aero, it is still a fantastic racket for topspin players as well. Now, I want to give a lot of credit to Babolat because they don't really change this racket that much. Since it came out in 1994, they haven't really messed around with the mold of the racket too much. Yes, they have taken out the Cortex system and have changed a few things, but overall, this racket has remained quite the same over the course of many years, and this is what a lot of these rackets who are in the top 5 have going for them. The companies were nice enough not to mess with the racket too much, and I think that's what helped them to have their longevity. Are you guys ready for the greatest tennis racket ever made? The absolute number one, nothing comes even close, and that is the Weed. Now, just kidding, guys, it's not the Weed, even though the Weed is an interesting racket. The number one racket of all time, and this might surprise you, that is coming from me, who's a Babolat fan, it is by far the Wilson Pro Staff. And guys, I'm going to tell you names of 3 players that have used this racket, and it is all I'm going to have to say about this racket is going to prove that it is the greatest racket of all time. And these 3 names are Sampras, Federer, and Jabeur. Okay, joking aside, even though I do love Hans Jabeur, one of my favorite players on the WTA, what else do you need to know about a racket than the names Sampras and Federer? These two guys are maybe the two GOATs. So who wouldn't want to play with the Pro Staff? But there's more to it. It is a racket that came out in 1984. Think about that. The Pro Staff came out in 1984 and it's still around today. And guys, this racket has been around forever and it's going to stay around forever because it's one of the most beautiful rackets ever designed. Yes, it has undergone some changes. This current version is 97 square inches. It's a lot bigger than the original version that Sampras used. However, I will say that this racket is more of a player's racket, especially if you play with this version of it. It is less commonly found on a WTA tour. However, there's tons of ATP players who use it, and it is interestingly one of the most popular rackets at the recreational level. Now, I'm suspecting that some recreational players like the idea of playing with this racket because Federer uses it, and they might not necessarily like the way this racket plays. But this, of course, doesn't apply to everyone. There's some recreational players who are naturally a little bit stronger. They can pull off playing with a racket like that. However, I have seen some that just want to play with Federer's racket, and this racket might not necessarily be the best racket for their level. Oh yeah, this is definitely something that's a little bit too much for me. It is on the heavier side. It's got low power, so you're gonna have to make the power yourself. It does have a quite good feel, I have to say. And now, most importantly, let's see how this racket behaves on my serve. Okay, I felt that a little bit on my shoulder. So personally, I'm not good enough to be able to pull off a racket like that, but it doesn't take away from the beauty of the Pro Staff. Aesthetically very pleasing to look at. It's got a very thin frame. It's just a beautiful design, and I had to give this racket the #1 spot because it deserves it. I'm going to have to recalibrate my arm. I do feel a little bit of a pain in my shoulder. It is my healing racket with healing properties, but nevertheless, this is my list, guys. Top 5 rackets. It's not biased. I gave it to Wilson at the end, that I used the longevity of these rackets, and one of the most important points, these rackets have all withstood the test of time, and unfortunately we can't say that for my Wilson Hammer 5.2, but I have one racket left, and I gotta tell you, just hitting a few balls, my arm already feels a lot better.